The illusion of solitude is seductive, especially in a dorm where privacy is fleeting and interruptions are inevitable. Reed had sunk into that deceptive quiet, stretching out on his bed, reveling in the cool kiss of his sheets against his bare skin. It wasn't about exhibitionism. It was about comfort, about shedding the weight of expectations, if only for a little while. With Parker out for the evening, lost in some study group or other, Reed let himself unwind completely. His phone screen flickered in the dim room, the soft hum of music filling the air, blending with the rhythmic beat of his breath. And then the sound, subtle at first, a shift in the hallway, a scrape of keys, the unmistakable click of the lock disengaging. Time fractured. The door swung open, spilling warm fluorescent light into the room. Parker's voice hitched mid-sentence, his steps halting abruptly. For a moment, neither of them moved, both caught in a breathless limbo. Reed's heart jackhammered against his ribs as realization dawned. He was exposed, utterly bare, and Parker was staring. A sharp inhale, a blink too slow, and then, finally, Parker spoke, voice low and strangely unreadable. Well, shit. The room felt different now, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of them knew how to navigate. Reed had scrambled for the blanket, the fabric cool against his overheated skin, but it was too late. Parker had already seen everything. And worse, he wasn't looking away. His breath was shallow. His fingers still curled around the doorknob, like he wasn't sure whether to step back or step further inside. The usual teasing, the cocky smirk that Parker always wore like armor, was absent. Instead, his gaze was dark, uncertain, curious. "Dude, Parker started, but his words faltered, hanging uselessly between them. Reed pulled the blanket tighter around his waist, tried to ignore the way his pulse pounded in his throat. "You said you'd be gone all night." His voice came out sharper than intended, edged with something too raw to name. Parker exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "Study group got canceled," he muttered. "I texted you." "My phone was on Do Not Disturb," Reed snapped back. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching between them like a thread pulled too tight. Parker's eyes flickered lower for just a second before dragging back up, lingering. It was reckless, but Reed couldn't stop himself from asking, "So, are you going to leave, or just keep staring?" Parker's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his tongue flicking out to wet his lips. His fingers tightened against the doorknob, but he didn't turn it. He didn't move. He stayed. The air between them was thick, humming with something neither of them dared to name. Parker still stood near the door, one hand gripping the knob like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. But he hadn't left. He hadn't even looked away, not really. His eyes kept flickering back, like he was trying to process what he had seen, like he wasn't sure whether he was supposed to regret it or commit it to memory. Reed's grip on the blanket was ironclad, his knuckles white, but his heart was beating too fast for it to be just embarrassment. There was something else curling in his stomach, something warm and electric, something that sent a shiver down his spine despite the heat pooling beneath his skin. Parker finally exhaled, shaking his head as if trying to clear some thought he didn't want to entertain. "Look, man, he hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't mean to walk in on you like that." Reed scoffed. "Yeah, no shit." That smirk, the one that usually softened any awkward situation between them, tried to flicker across Parker's lips, but it didn't quite land. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, gaze flickering downward again for just a second too long. It was subtle, but Reed caught it. And despite himself, despite the fact that he knew this was dangerous, he couldn't help but test it. "So," he said, his voice deliberately casual, "you just gonna stand there?" Or Parker's jaw tensed. His fingers twitched against the doorknob, but still he didn't leave. The silence stretched between them, weighted and fragile, balancing on the edge of something neither of them knew how to define. Parker still hadn't moved, still stood with one foot in the room and one foot out, like he was stuck between instincts, one screaming at him to leave, the other begging him to stay. Reed watched him, pulse hammering, gripping the blanket like it was the only thing keeping him from completely unraveling. Then Parker did something unexpected. Slowly, deliberately, he let go of the doorknob. His fingers twitched at his sides, a tell Reed had learned to recognize. Nervousness masked as nonchalance. Parker was thinking too hard, overanalyzing, fighting against something that was already slipping past the cracks of whatever walls he had built. So, is this the part where we just pretend nothing happened? Reed asked, voice lower than he intended. He wasn't sure why he said it, whether it was a challenge, a test, or just an attempt to break the unbearable tension stretching between them. Parker's jaw tightened. He inhaled sharply, his chest rising, falling, before he let out a short laugh. Humorless, unsteady. Yeah, well, kind of hard to pretend when it's all I can think about. Reed's breath caught. The words felt heavier than they should have, sinking into the air between them like a confession neither of them were ready to acknowledge. Parker looked at him, then really looked at him, and this time he didn't glance away. And this time Reed didn't want him to. The air between them was electric, pulsing with something unspoken, something thick enough to touch. Reed still clutched the blanket against his bare skin, not out of modesty, but because he needed something to ground him, something to keep his hands from trembling. Parker hadn't moved from the door, but he wasn't leaving either. That was the part that mattered. I should go, Parker said, but the words didn't carry conviction, didn't sound like someone who actually planned on walking away. Reed swallowed, his mouth dry, heart hammering. Then why haven't you? Parker exhaled sharply, shaking his head. His fingers flexed at his sides like he was resisting the urge to reach for something or someone. Because, he said, voice quieter now, more strained, I don't think I want to. The confession settled between them, thick as the heat radiating from Reed's flushed skin. He wasn't sure which one of them moved first, only that suddenly Parker was closer, just barely within arm's reach, and Reed wasn't backing away. His heart pounded in his chest, his grip loosening on the blanket, allowing it to slip just slightly lower. Parker's gaze flickered downward for the briefest second before he caught himself, dragging his eyes back to Reed's face. But the damage had already been done. That look, the way his pupils darkened, how his breathing hitched, sent a thrill straight through Reed's core. A single thought burned through his mind as Parker hovered there, hesitating, his body taut with restraint. If he touches me, I won't stop him. The air between them crackled, the space too charged, too tight, as if the room itself had shrunk. Reed was painfully aware of every breath Parker took, the way his chest rose and fell, the faint scent of his cologne, clean, sharp, familiar. Neither of them had spoken in what felt like an eternity, yet neither had moved away either. Parker's gaze lingered, tracing the edge of the blanket draped loosely over Reed's hips. His fingers flexed, curling and uncurling, as if fighting some internal war. Reed, he murmured, voice low and uneven. It wasn't a question, but Reed felt the weight of it like one. His own breath came shallower now, his pulse a frantic rhythm beneath his skin. He didn't want to be the one to break this moment, to shatter whatever fragile thing was unraveling between them. But the longer Parker stared, the harder it was to pretend nothing was happening. So he did the one thing he shouldn't have. He let the blanket slip just a little further. It wasn't much, just enough to expose the sharp cut of his hip bone, the dip of his lower abdomen, but it was enough. Enough to make Parker's breath hitch. Enough to make his gaze darken, his throat bob as he swallowed hard. For a single, excruciating second, Parker stayed frozen, caught in hesitation, in restraint. Then, as if something inside him had finally snapped, he closed the distance, one hand pressing into the mattress beside Reed. His body dangerously close, his voice hushed. Tell me to leave, Parker whispered. Reed didn't. The silence between them was thick, humming with a tension neither of them wanted to name. Parker's breath was unsteady, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matched Reed's own. The space between them felt small, fragile, like a thread stretched too tight, threatening to snap at any moment. Reed could feel the warmth of Parker's skin even without touching him. It was intoxicating, that quiet heat, The awareness of his presence, so close yet not quite enough. He wasn't sure when he had started wanting this, if it had been buried beneath years of friendship, waiting to surface, or if it was something new, something raw and terrifying. But now, with Parker staring at him like that, like he was something Parker wanted to take apart piece by piece, there was no denying it. Parker's fingers twitched where they rested against the bed, hesitation laced through every movement. He was waiting for Reed to break first, to push him away, to tell him this was a mistake. But Reed wasn't going to. Instead, he shifted just slightly, the blanket slipping another inch. Parker's gaze followed the movement, his jaw tightening, his fingers flexing against the sheets. "Reed," he said again, softer this time, but there was something different in his voice now, something deeper, heavier, like he had already made his choice. Reed swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I'm not stopping you," he whispered. And just like that, the thread between them snapped. Parker moved first, fast, deliberate, no more hesitation. His hands found Reed's skin, hot and desperate, pulling him into something neither of them would ever be able to take back. The air between them was thick with something neither of them had the words to describe. Parker's hands still lingered on Reed's skin, his fingers pressing lightly, like he was memorizing the feel of him. Neither of them moved, the world outside their small dorm room forgotten, reduced to the quiet, shallow breaths they shared. Reed's heart pounded against his ribs, his body still humming from everything that had just happened. He felt raw, exposed, but not in a way that made him want to retreat. It was different with Parker. Being seen by him wasn't something to be ashamed of. If anything, it made him feel more real, more alive than he ever had before. Parker let out a breath. His lips still parted, his gaze tracing over Reed's face like he was searching for something. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, rough around the edges. Reed nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah," he whispered. "More than okay." Parker's mouth tilted into something between a smirk and a smile, his thumb brushing idly over Reed's wrist. "Good," he murmured, leaning in just a little. Reed felt it again, that pull, the invisible gravity that had always been there between them, waiting to be acknowledged. It wasn't just desire, wasn't just heat. It was something deeper, something undeniable. For the first time in a long time, Reed wasn't afraid of it. He reached for Parker, closing the distance again, this time without hesitation. Drinking in the sight of him in this quiet, vulnerable state, relaxed, unguarded, his lips slightly parted like he was lost in a dream. It felt surreal. Just hours ago, they had crossed a line neither of them could step back from. It should have been terrifying, the weight of what had happened, the unknown of what came next. But it wasn't. It felt right, like something that had been waiting to happen for a long time had finally clicked into place. Parker shifted, his body stretching slightly before his eyes fluttered open, finding Reed's in the morning stillness. A slow, sleepy smile tugged at his lips. "Morning," he murmured, voice heavy with sleep. "Morning," Reed whispered back, unable to stop his own smile. For a moment, they just lay there, neither of them moving, their fingers still lightly tangled beneath the sheets. No rush, no panic, just the quiet realization that they weren't just waking up in the same bed. They were waking up together, and that changed everything.